Okay, fantastic. So we should be all golden. Okay, so thank you again for meeting with me. Just for the sake of everyone who's going to be watching this, would you be okay to introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. I am Dr. Nikki Fairchild, and I am an associate professor in Creative Methodologies and Education in the School of Education, Language and Linguistics. I have two roles in the school. One of those is I lead the Research Excellence Framework, so the REF framework for our faculty in our school, particularly around education. So part of that role is to work with our associate heads of research and to work with colleagues who are publishing articles and developing impact to just make sure that they're ready for any sort of assessment exercises that may happen on a regular basis and to provide some support and mentoring around writing and publications. So that's one of my roles. Um, the other role that I have is part of a funded project between University of Portsmouth, Portsmouth City Council, and local organisations which sit under the conduit of the Hive, which is an organisation that works with communities. This particular project is a 5-year project, so this is coming to the end of year one. And what we're trying to do is to develop or to work with other researchers to support projects that are trying to understand health inequalities in the local area. Because what the council are wanting to do is to use the outcomes of some of these projects to look at policy making and practice making around health inequalities. So it's a public health project, which is a little bit curveball because I'm an education specialist. But because I'm used to working with and developing research teams and I use a range of creative methodologies, I think what I can bring to the project is some of those connections that I have in the institution, but also some of the different ways to do research.
And I love that. I mean, that's kind of the dream, right? To be able to have that practical experience, the research experience, and then to get into some policy. And like you say, even though you are specialized in education, there are so many overlaps in the terms of how you research with people, how you make them feel comfortable, how you make connections, how you create projects. I love that.
Definitely.
That's fantastic.
And a lot
So
of this is stuff done in the community as well, so that it's working with community researchers around participatory action research, which is something I'm really familiar with, which is great.
fantastic. I love that. So in terms of the article we're going to be talking about today, this I understand isn't part of that project, right? This was a previous project.
Which article is that?
Oh, so we're looking at let me get up the exact title. I have all the notes, but not the title in front of me. So we are going to chat about, hang on, let me get the exact title up. Quality early childhood education and care practices, the importance of
Okay,
skills, knowledge, and early childhood graduate practitioner competences.
that was linked to another funded project that I did with Dr. Mikuska a couple of years ago, I think it was now. So yes, I'm happy to talk about that one because I remember that one very well, very fondly.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. But if we can ever come back to chat about participatory, I would love that because I use participatory methods as well. And I think that is such a fascinating space that I would love to chat about more. But in terms of this one, first of all, I thought it was an incredibly interesting article. And what I loved about it was the way that you situated it in literature really excellently, but also in policy, because I think that is one of the benefits of being in the sector is that you know firsthand, inside and out, the policies that are impacting, and you're able to zone in on them. But I also thought the methods you used were really interesting. So before I get into it, I have a bunch of questions to keep me on topic before I just ask you absolutely everything, which
Yeah.
I would love to. So I think the first thing in then is about your professional experience, or your either in as in education or in the university. How did that impact your focus?
I think it probably impacted in a number of different ways. So this particular project was concerned with educators of early years educators. Now, I have been in academia for 12 years now, um, and I started off leading a program that was around early years professionals and early years teachers. It was a program that the government introduced to try and ensure that there were graduate leaders of practice in the early years. So I taught and led some of those programs at another institution. Also was really familiar with this idea of graduateness in the workforce, because currently the workforce qualification requirement is an NVQ level 3, which is equivalent to, I think, 2 A levels, but it's a very practice-based accreditation rather than having a lot of theory attached to it. So I've been working with an organisation called Early Childhood Studies Degrees Network, who was trying to really sell the benefits of having those graduate level leadership roles in early years, which don't sit within the funding structure necessarily, but allow for that real depth of knowledge and understanding so people can understand the theory behind why rather than just the why. So this particular project was funded by the Early Childhood Studies Degrees Network, for us to try and engage with practitioners who had degrees to understand their experiences and what we could learn from that. So this is where one of the articles came from.
Fantastic. And I thought what you did really well was identify the gap in the literature, because there is a lot of writing on teacher professionalism more generally, like you have Stephen Ball and Beck and Biesta to some extent. And coming from a secondary background, it was a hot topic for us to be like, are we professionals? Are we being deprofessionalized? But you identified that because of the way that the policies are structured around early years, that it's just under researched, it's underexplored on so many levels.
Absolutely. And particularly from a UK perspective, there's been quite a lot of international research around professionalism and leadership and degree educated educators. And I think UK has been really behind the curve because in early years, the required accreditation to work in the sector is an NVQ level 3, which is a practice accreditation, which I'm not knocking at all because it's really, really important. But most of that stuff is done on site, so on-site training with some college engagement. So I think the theory is really missing. And we were trying to do in the research is to really understand graduates' perspectives and graduates' experience and their understandings and how they got that and where it came from. Because we think it's really important to have a graduate-led workforce. And funding came, like I said, from the Early Childhood Studies Degrees Network, and they are really petitioning government at the moment, again, with a new minister in place, new government, to actually try and encourage the graduate leadership route to become more focused and clear, because even the current graduate leadership routes are more vocational rather than academic.
Which is really interesting there, because I appreciate I read what I found you made a point where it was there's like this like lack of consistency in what the government wants from early years. So in sometimes they're using the word childcare, other times they're kind of suggesting that the staff are just well qualified and skilled, but also they're just people looking after children. And it's if there is so much emphasis on those like vital first years and them being, so important for developing the skills that children need, using terms like looking after is something completely different. So there's an inconsistency there, isn't there, really?
Agreed. And I think that this reflects some of the policy challenges over the last 10 years that originally, before we have got a Conservative government, there was a Labour government that really focused on professionalism around about 2010. They were really focused on trying to develop a graduate-led workforce. Unfortunately, they weren't prepared to put in the funding that was going to match the aspirations for a graduate-led workforce, because most early years settings are funded through government funding and private parents paying for their children to actually come to nursery. So I think the challenge is that really only funds an NVQ level 3 sort of A-level equivalent practice qualification in many of the staff, but not in all of the staff. And there was a huge push in the early 2010s and in those 10 years up to 2020 to try and really think about these proper routes for progression for people to come in maybe as an apprentice and then move through all the way up to graduate, which is why the degree programs were very much vocational and degree programs together. So there was practice elements and theoretical elements. Unfortunately, we've gone back to the point now where the current government does want to have graduates, but it's how they see those graduates and how they see them placed probably more in schools, because they're expanding schools nursery provision rather than actually in the early years sector, which has a different vibe to reception and school nursery provision. School nursery provision for some of the discussions I've been having tends to be very much focused on outcomes and how we can ensure children are ready for reception, which is a misnomer in itself, whereas general early years provision is more about well-being and play and children being able to construct their own understandings of the world. So I think there's a disconnect between the two. And I think the disconnect is being magnified through the current policy, because all we talk about is school readiness, not life readiness.
Which I think you've hit. This is a side topic I would love to chat about more another time, because I think there's a tension there, isn't it? That in order to get the funding, it potentially means you have to follow a prescribed way of teaching and what pedagogy is, which I think is applicable to lots of the sectors. But thank you for explaining all that. And I think it's important, because being able to situate it, like you said, you've drawn upon international literature, which can be really valuable when there is not enough research inside your own context, but then linking it into the wider kind of context of problems that are happening. And then you mentioned in your article how this then feeds into, if you want people to be graduates and blah, blah, you then have to consider the pay, because that's another like added on addition there, that if you have graduates, they're going to expect pay in line with other graduates.
Yeah, agreed. And that the biggest challenge I think facing the nursery sector is the fact that nursery settings tend to be open from sort of 7, 8 till in the morning till maybe 6, 7 at night. And although there's shift work in there, it is long hours and it is hard work. And the way that the funding stream works doesn't, even with the private nature of the businesses, doesn't allow for graduates to have commensurate salaries for graduates, say teachers, unless you are a maintained nursery school, because you get different funding streams. So I think that there's all these different challenges around this whole idea of professionalisation and the desire to have graduates, to have them on salaries that are non-graduate level, which means people stay for a year or two and then they go off potentially into teacher education because they have better pay terms and conditions there.
Which is in itself such a shame, because like you say, there's so much research on the importance of early years, but there is that tension in policy that if it's so important, the professionals in that space should be respected as such, right?
I think we can also look to European models where graduates are much more common working in the sector and pay is much more commensurate with teachers' pay. And I think that probably sits in the fact that most of Northern Europe particularly is very much socially democratically aware. So the pay reflects the fact that early years is seen as a really, really key and important part of the education for life, not just education for school, whereas our focus is purely on education for school. And the private sector has a huge foothold because that's just where the way historically early years has been constructed.
Which is so interesting. And I think I often adopt kind of like a post-qualitative feminist lens. So when I'm reading this, immediately my mind is going to, is it because the sector is seen as feminine and does that?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's exactly what it is. They're just women who look after children is really some of the broader discourses, I think, that sort of float around. Also, I think that there's this idea that young children just require personal care and the education stuff is a side issue rather than the fact that actually these young children are already competent and capable. Their brains are so full, and our job as educators is to try and enhance some of those things and to just give them open windows into other aspects of the world that they haven't been able to see yet. So the complexity is really huge. You don't follow a prescribed script or a lesson plan. Just go with the moment and see where it takes you,
Which is incredible, by the way. I was an early years teacher for all of a year, and it was the hardest year of my life because I've tried to look into more understanding the brain mental and understanding how there's all this synapses and the shedding, because I was like, how anyone can really teach fine motor versus gross motor. I have nothing but respect because it's so individualized and it's so specialist and not a skill I realized I had. I started to be like, do I have fine motor skills? I don't know anymore. I'm done.
And this is where I think you're talking about post-qualitative inquiry. That's an interesting term in itself, which I could probably spend another hour talking about. But I do think that when you're starting to look at those broader relational engagements that young children have with their environment, you need better frames and general traditional qualitative research. So I think that's really interesting in itself. And I've been working in the field of post theories. I'm not even sure I like the word post-qual anymore. It
Yeah, yeah.
denotes a particular lineage and a particular way of doing things. But this idea of thinking beyond some of the current theoretical orientations that we have has been a bit of a preoccupation of mine for the past 6 years. So
Which is really interesting actually, because I that was something I wanted to draw upon. Maybe we'll jump into methods, 'cause I think we've done the literature review really well. So your methods for the article I'm talking about was with interviews and surveys. So surveys with 105 and then interviews that followed. And the one I'm discussing was the kind of feedback from the owners, managers, and practitioners. And I know that there was a side kind of it formulate a bigger project with the students themselves. And feel free to talk
yeah,
about both because it's a whole project in itself.
yeah,
Um, when you chose to use surveys and
yeah.
interviews, what were some of the motivations that brought you there?
I think we wanted to use a survey as an initial tool because
Mm.
we really acknowledged that the people on the research team had worked in the sector. So we already bring along our own ideas and our views. Some people would call it a bias. I think that can be quite positive sometimes, but you've got to recognise when it isn't. So I think we wanted to try and not be more dispassionate, but we wanted to try and reach out to people. We knew that most employees, if you're full time, you're working up to 40 hours a week. You don't have time to come out and do interviews necessarily. So we wanted to try and target broader spectrum of people. So we started off with a survey. I'm not a big fan of surveys, but we thought that they could be something that would just give us some insights that would help us maybe then move on to the interview phases when we started to talk directly to people. Um, so part of the research was funded by the Early Childhood Studies Degrees Network, and they were able to help get members to share surveys out. And also, we were able to reach out to other universities to see if they would have people who might want to partake in the semi-structured interviews as well. So having that connection with the network, I think, was really key because it made some of the participant decisions around who would be participants a lot easier. And we did try and reach out nationally. I'm not quite sure whether we actually ever got really truly national, but it just gave us a different window to try and rather than go back to settings that we've been to before and who are really busy and they're thinking, God, what are you doing coming back here again, asking us more questions? So we didn't want to saturate other research sites that we'd use because people have given their time freely before in the past.
Which is such an interesting reflection because this is something I have found with my own research. So I started like arts-based focus groups, and I was like, this, it would be fantastic. They would be like, I am so like, I feel like this is going to be such a great moment for everyone. And the reality was, I have had to change my methodology to include online interviews because the practitioners I want to research with just don't have the time to meet me for 3 focus groups. And then it becomes that pragmatic approach to education, to research, where you have to weigh up, okay, well, what is my preferred way of researching? But then how am I going to be able to get the data? And how am I going to be able to get people's voices heard in a way that meets them as well? And then it feeds into a little bit that you have often when you have funding or when you have any deadline, you have to meet it. And you have to potentially meet it in a way that some funders will understand as well. I know obviously participatory is fantastic, but sometimes some spaces would prefer surveys or more. I know you use qualitative, more quant data,
Yeah,
etc.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's the real key is that you've got to balance all these different conflicting priorities. And as we're researching in education, you have to meet people where they are, which
Yeah,
means that it could mean that we would have interviews at 6 o'clock at night, or
yeah,
we just say, okay, we understand that you can't do it, so can we try a weekend or and a survey? We can keep it as quick as easy as possible,
yeah.
really clear, so that actually someone could complete it in 10 minutes and not feel like they've been taking part but not feel overburdened. So it's trying to get all those balances right, and we don't always do it correctly as researchers. Or I think I was thinking as you're talking, ethics is really important. I think you've got to think about ethics as a broader process than just your ethical approval. How can you be ethical with your participants? How can you put yourself in their shoes and think, God, I've got 10 minutes, but I can't do this. What can I do in 10 minutes? So I think that if you have ethics as that core part of your research design and that broader approach to ethics around thinking about other people and that whole idea about if you're the arts professionals who are busy, what can you do? How can you remunerate them if you can? Can you give them a voucher to say thank you? Even those small ethical decisions can make a really big difference. And coming from a feminist perspective, again, it's not about extracting knowledge and then going, right, thanks very much, but it's about having them as part of that process as well, which I think is really important.
It's so funny because my next thing was like I want to talk about ethics because I wrote down notes when I was reading and I loved the fact that you referred directly to timing and you said it would be like 30 minutes to an hour and that they would be like no more than 15 to 20 minutes because people are very busy. And I think it's that professional insight that when you can bring it to ethics, and then obviously that happens in the moment and in practice because ethics goes on way beyond the ethics form and things always crop up. But I think definitely the remunerate, my accent can't say the word, but in sense of giving back as well, because I think there can be sometimes it can be like, well, this would be benefit for the sector, and that can really draw people in. People are passionate; they feel like they're having their say. But it can be quite difficult, I think, when you're balancing. You're like, I've got this amazing research project. I like you will. This is so great for everyone. Join, and then you have to consider, like, actually, is it really great for everyone? Like, what are they
Yeah,
getting from this?
yeah,
And
definitely.
the way I've kind of approached it a little bit is I've tried to design my focus groups around like professional development in my subject. So I can like, I'll share all my resources with you if that can be
Yeah,
helpful. But there's still an element of how can we make sure this is worthwhile for everyone?
absolutely. And this particular project was funded. So we had that in the funding application. And subsequent funding applications that I've been doing, it always ensures I've done some projects with the local authority, and it always ensures that there is some kind of way to give back. So, for example, we were giving £15 local shopping vouchers for people in the local authority research. So, if you can do that, if you can build it into your funding bid application, do think about your participants because they are giving up their time and their knowledge, and it's just a way of recognising some of that. And we invited them to come back and talk about findings if they wanted to, and sharing articles with them. I mean, many people don't take that up. I just think if you're thinking about that ethics and that not extracting but trying to work collaboratively, there are some mechanisms you can put in place and offer, even if no one decides to take them up. And then it means that you've taken an ethical perspective more broadly.
I love that. The concept of co-dissemination, I think, is so empowering, especially when academia and especially educational settings can be so separate. It's fantastic. So I think you've touched on, I was going to ask about your professional experience, but it's clearly it all fits in fantastically. Was there anything ethically that maybe that came up during that was it, something that maybe was a bit of a surprise or something that, or just many of your research, something that has ever been
Yeah.
like, oh, that was an interesting, something I didn't expect.
Yeah, I think it's sometimes the stories that you hear. Um, I've generally always done some kind of qualitative research, whether it be interviews or focus groups or creative arts-based methods. Those can take you off in a really different direction, and those don't tend to be some of the things that I've necessarily done for research with early childhood, particularly. But I think it's just about being mindful and thoughtful and planning for other eventualities. Sometimes people just don't turn up and you can't get hold of them. And if I contact someone 3 times and they've not responded, then I have to stop at that point. So you've actually got to decenter yourself from being the researcher and thinking, I need to speak to 20 people and realize that I've only spoken to 15 and the other five, they're ignoring me. So they obviously don't want to be part of the research anymore. And I think there's something about not having that fixity of I must do this. I think it's about thinking I want to do this, but I acknowledge that not everyone's as excited about my research as I am. So I've just got to take what I can and work with who I can and try and behave respectfully with them, listen to what they've got to say, find some way to compensate them, even if it's, a meal voucher or something, to thank them for their time and to go back to them and say, these are the outcomes. This is what I found. This is what I found collectively. Quite a lot of researchers, and what some of the research I've been doing recently, we're doing a come back together after the analysis and saying, let's discuss what we found. This is what we found. How does that sit with you? Does that work for you? Didn't do it in this particular project, but I am doing it with some of the projects I'm working forward with. How does does this is this meaningful? Did we interpret this in the way that you meant it? And I think that some of the challenges is when you have a collection of data, you analyze and you interpret, but the actual participant meaning gets lost because you you sort of mash stuff together and say, this is my theme on. So I think it can be really useful if you can to go back to your participants and just share some of that with them. And they might go, actually, I didn't really mean that. This is what I really meant, which could also enhance your research. Like I say, that tends to be if I've got funding because the timescales are longer. So it's
Yeah.
about thinking through how you could do, they call it member checking sometimes, but that sounds quite decontextualized. So
Yeah.
how can you share and validate what you're doing, you know?
Which is really interesting because I think it's so when I did my master's, I did member checking of sorts, but then it then impacts I had to research with a far smaller number of people because there were we were creating a suggestion list for a school. But then I had to go back and when they member checked it with me and they all gave their feedback. But then you have to balance that it's going to be far smaller groups, it's going to be less representative potentially, but that means the people I do have, we've checked. But another thing, though, is in about data transcription. So when you transcribed your data, would you ever suggest the students send the transcript to the participants for them to check?
I think that can be really useful. It all depends if you want to do that. I would say speak to the participants up front so they're aware they're going to do that. You might offer it, and they might say, no, that's fine, because people have busy lives, particularly educators. But I think that's something about ethics is you could actually build that into your research design. So before you've recruited your participants, you've got a really clear checklist or guidelines as to what that you're going to ask them to do and what that means for them. And I think if you do that up front and they know and they can and that they can decline to check if they don't want to, I think there's something really important about that participation. You're keeping them as part of the research, and they could actually say, oh, I didn't really mean it like that, this is how I meant it. So I think that can be a really useful thing to do, but your participants need to know in advance so it doesn't become a shock to them and they go, well, I haven't got time to check this is going to be a problem. So it's about keeping that really transparent with your participants so they're aware.
I love the way you've considered that though from so many perspectives because I've done it one time because I was talking about sexting. So it was so politically charged anyways. I wanted to remind participants through the interview, like, if you want, you can come back and change something. I'm not going to take this like as it is, blah, blah, blah. But there is an element that you're like, wow, I'm doing so, I'm giving them but then it's also you are potentially asking them to do more work. And that pressure for participants because they're like, oh, well, research is going to be useful. I want to help. And you have to come from the other side to be like, am I going to add on additional workload? What are the benefits here? Let's weigh it up.
I agree. And I think that's where part of that, letting your participants know exactly what you want them to do is really important, and giving them the option just to opt out if they want to, because they might say, I'm happy to be interviewed, but I don't care about, I'm not going to check it afterwards. So it's about being really explicit all the time. And so there's no hidden surprises where they come back and go, oh, I didn't realize you wanted me to do that.
Yeah.
And again, you do that in your information and consent form if you do the paperwork for the ethics approval, but just be really explicit with them, because I think that's just good research practice.
I think it is. And it's funny because even though the ethics form, I know it can feel, it can be quite daunting. It's long, but I find whenever I write one, it helps me really solidify exactly what it is I'm doing because you have to be so specific. Like, where are you going to interview? How are you going to interview? What are you going to do if this happens? And what is your interview questions? And it just makes you have to really zone in to be like, what is this going to look like in reality? Because there's so many potentials and you just have to, of course there might be a time you have to be pragmatic and you need space for that on the ethics form. You can say, if this happens, I will go this or my supervisor. But I've always really appreciated it more than anything else really, to be like, really refine what you actually want here.
Definitely. You're talking about the ethics form. I think it's really key for you. Our university ethics form feels like a mountain to climb because there's lots to go in it. The more you put in the ethics form, actually, for me, it helps me solidify what I'm actually trying to do.
Yeah.
So if you can be really clear and actually speaking in clear, plain English, trying to avoid technical terms, subject terms, make it really clear. This is what I'm going to do. This is why I'm going to do it. This is what any potential impacts are. And this is what I'm going to do to mitigate them. And I think if you can actually do that, it actually helps you when you write up the piece as an article or a report, because you've done a lot of the thinking already. So as much as that ethics form may seem like a chore, the more effort you put into it, actually it makes the rest of your research easier. So that would be my advice to all students. It might seem awful and really long-winded, but don't look at it like that. Look at this as it's going to make my life easier as I move through the project. And also I can be really clear what my ethical commitments are and what I'm going to do if something doesn't go quite as well as I want it to, or how I'm going to work with participants.
And I love that advice because I still know my ethics form. I'm not going to tell you how many words was in there. It was huge, but I go back to it every couple of days because you forget things. I have like a whole project, so I go back and I'm like, what exactly did I say I was going to ask you? What? How did I frame that? How did I say I was going to reach out to these people? Just so I can remind myself, like, okay, that was my goal. Because before you know it, you've read something is interesting and you've convinced yourself you were doing that approach. And you
Definitely.
come back to it. So in terms of data analysis, you touched upon something a little while ago, but I didn't want to stop you at that point. It's that balance between a lot of you on the project were experts and a lot of students were coming in with practical experience. How did you balance your expertise when you were data analyzing versus what the participants were saying, especially if you didn't necessarily agree with something?
I don't think you read a lot of things about you can bracket off your brain. You can bracket it. I personally can't bracket off my brain, but what I can do is be aware of the biases and the subjectivities that I bring into the research. And when you're working with a research team, it actually makes it easy is not the right word, but you've got sounding boards. So I'm going to use another project I'm working on at the moment because we've been doing a lot of this recently. Is that we're exploring speech and language development in young children. So initially we've interviewed people who work with young children, so Home Start volunteers and those sorts of things. And we've got 12 or 14 interviews that our researchers are actually analysing and looking at the themes that come from that. What we're actually doing is coming together as a team regularly and talking them through. And again, that's a bit of sense checking and sort of member checking, integrated reliability type checking. But it's about being really clear about where you think some of these things are and when they might change. And even though they were coded, when you start to generate the themes and you think about reflexive thematic analysis, that's when things can shift a little bit as well. And so I think that being really open to the way your coding might take you. And again, there's something about having your research question and aims, which are really important, but actually you shouldn't allow that to drive necessarily your coding process if your coding is saying something different. So I think it's about that constant reflexivity and the interplay between the research question and aims and the data and what the data is telling you, because the data is telling you is what the data is telling you. That may or may not meet your research question and aims, and that may mean that you need to go back and relook at some of the research question and aims, shape them a little bit, tweak them a little bit, or write some different ones, because you can't fit a square peg into a round hole or vice versa, you know. You've got to be more flexible, and the data is telling you what your participants is saying. And it's always nice to have member checking. So on the project we're on, there's 4 of us. So it means we can actually do some member checking. Have those conversations with your supervisor if you're doing a master's or PhD EdD, or even at undergraduate level. You know, do that sense checking. Sometimes just talking about it makes you think differently about the way that you've done things. So it's about being really open and honest and acknowledging what your own subjectivities, and I hate the word biases, but it's probably the only word that's going to work, any biases that you might bring to the picture. And as the people who did this project all worked in the early years sector before, we already came with our own preconceived ideas of what we thought good practice was. So I think it's useful to have those discussions as a team, because we could actually challenge each other at that point and challenge people around the data analysis as well.
And I love that. That's fantastic because I think it's really difficult because, like you say, even sometimes people read Brown and Clark as a suggestion that you can read it once and code it and then you apply your theory. But I know whenever I've tried, I'm immediately like, I would pick up the words that most interest me because of my, like I said, I read yours and I was like, gender, like straight away, because that's how I'm thinking. And I think it links back to that member checking. And if you're in a research team, it's fantastic. But if you have the potential to ask your participants, like, what do you think about this? But it's also, I think it's fine in a sense, because this article didn't necessarily, you drew upon a few kind of literature and theories in a sense, but it wasn't as explicitly grounded as other articles can be. And even if you do say you want to explicitly ground it in Bordeaux or Foucault, that's okay, just as long as you are making it really clear that that's the approach you are planning on using and that
Yeah,
you are analyzing
absolutely.
it from this. And I think
Absolutely.
that you need to consider, if you are doing that, what your outcome is. So if you are just presenting an analysis, and that's fine, but if it's something, like yours, for example, was aiming to impact policy in some way, you may have to consider and reflect and be like, is it appropriate to be very theory heavy? Is it appropriate?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then it's considered.
Yeah,
'Cause
I
then
agree.
in times like that, maybe it's not enough to say, oh well, I'm using Bordeaux, blah, blah, blah. You may need to bring it back.
I agree. And there's something about that justification of your theoretical orientations and the theory that underpins your research. This research is very much a constructivist, traditional constructivist type research, because we were constructing and participants were constructing their narratives, and we were then, taking some of those constructions and then working those together as an entirety across the different participants. So I think that the theory that you use underpins the way that you develop your research project. I have students who work with Bourdieu and Foucault, and of course, if they work in those ways, the questions that they ask are very much linked to the theoretical underpinnings. The way that they design the research is important. And the research I've been doing post this project is taken what they call a post-qualitative perspective. And again, I have problems with that term anyway, but this is not the time for it. The collective I work with has been calling it indisciplined inquiry because it doesn't fit to any particular discipline and any particular methodology or method, but it very much is the theory takes us where we need to go, and then the method just sort of follows. So I think that it's about from a researcher perspective, whether you're a student, whether you're an educator, whether you're an academic or whatever, you have to find that connection between. For me, theory is really, really important. The theory has to sort of be the starting point. And then how do you then use that to really infuse the whole of your research? And that then also connects to the ethics as well. And what sort of ethical frame are you taking? Is yours the ethics of everything, or is this something a bit more tight and bounded? And the way I see it is for students or academics, it doesn't bother me what you do, but you have to justify your rationale for that. I might not agree with you, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. But you do have to have that justification. And I sense the paper may not have some of that. Our report has the more of justification around why we picked these particular methods and what the methodology was and how we then analysed. So it's having that golden thread from the start of your research design all the way through the project that allows for that rigour, particularly in a qualitative research project, because there's a lot of question, and I find this quite problematic about, oh, it's not very rigorous because you only spoke to a few people. Well, it is rigorous because you justify what your rigour is in that regard. So I think that it's about keeping those at the forefront of your mind and justifying why you've done what you've done. Because who can question it if the justification is good?
I could not agree more. And I love it when I see different people just approaching it differently because for some people, I've read some of the best articles I've read have been with 5 people, but the descriptions were so rich. But then I've read similar ones with 2,000 people who used quantitative surveys like Likert scale. And I was like, that is so fascinating too. And it's different ways of approaching it. And I like something, this is a bit of a side note, but you've touched on something really big here. In your article, it didn't fully address it because articles are incredibly short on words. So this is a common thing I find across all articles. And when I was a student, when I was trying to find justifications or especially ethics with children and like what would you do in the moment, but the word counts on journal articles are very limited, sometimes 7,000 words, sometimes less. If for students they were trying to explore, because I'm doing this conversation for that reason. Is there any way you suggest looking? You've mentioned reports, but to see if they wanted to ascertain a little bit more how academics are justifying their research aims.
Yeah, I think that in some articles that you will see that justification. And I think your literature review section of your article can actually help you provide that. So yeah. When you start to develop that literature review section, I hate the word, I think I might have said this already. If I have apologies, I hate the word gaps because there's no such thing as a gap. It's just something that people haven't really thought through yet.
I think I called it a gap at the start and I love that. It's interesting. No, I do love, I like the way you just framed that though, because yeah.
So I think your literature review section of your article almost becomes the way in which you justify your research question and aim. So you can actually, you can even be explicit about it. You know, the literature talks about this. It hasn't got quite a lot of this in, and this is where my research is focused because I felt that there was an area that had been under researched. So I think that there are ways that you can do that when you write up an article, particularly because of the word count, it becomes more challenging, but you can find ways to say that in a few sentences, you know. So I do think that you can fit that justification in there. But the lit review section, again, needs to be some sort of précis or summary because you can't include everything. If you have a report, say we had a 10,000 word report, so we could have quite a chunky literature review, but we wouldn't put all of that in the article. It's about picking up some of the key things that you want to synthesize for smaller pieces of writing. So writing an article is not necessarily easy. However, there's something systematic about how you can go about these sorts of things. And if you get to the point where you think, oh God, I'm trying to tell the story of everything, maybe you need 2 articles or 3 articles. So it's, a friend of mine calls it slicing and dicing. Eva, she talks a lot about slicing and dicing, you know. Don't try and cram too much in one article. Think, what is the key message I want to get over today on this? And which other messages am I going to put somewhere else and write about later on? And that's the way you sustain an academic career, by cutting things up and to basically you build on each one as you go.
And I think that's so important because I think it applies to publishing, but also writing dissertations or anything, is that you are going to feel so personally attached to this data that trying to cut it you will be like, but this quote was so great because you can remember being in the moment with that participant. But it's about thinking, do I need to include all of it? Like, and it's about, and it can be quite tough. I know I've personally struggled with that sometimes, and I'm like, can't I submit 30,000 words? Like, why won't the journal accept it? But you've got to just start thinking really critically about it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that that's a skill that takes time to manage. And it's, someone told me about killing your darlings. I know that sounds a little bit harsh, but I actually think that that's really important. You have to work out, what are you trying to focus on in this particular piece of work? And what is really interesting but not quite so relevant that you can put somewhere else? So this is the key part, is that don't try and overload people, even in a dissertation. Be more focused, be more clear, think what your research question and aims were and use those as a guide. Because you might have found out really loads of fabulous incidental stuff. Do they help you answer your research question and aims? Do they contribute to what you're trying to do in that piece of work? And all that beautiful stuff, park it, because you will always be able to find a place to put that somewhere else. You develop another article, you do another collaboration. Maybe it's a starting point of another piece of research. Yeah. So it's all about, pipelining is key, I think, in academia. So you don't have to tell the story of everything in one piece of work.
And I think that's really powerful. And it links back to your previous point then about like the research and question aims at the start, because a very good friend of mine was doing some research about meaningful physical education, and they are a ethnic minority man living in the UK. So that in their mind hasn't been fleshed out really in the space of meaningful PE. So they were like, this is really interesting, I'm going to go explore it. And as they went through the process of their research with students, a large section of the students wanted to talk about gender more than they necessarily wanted to talk about ethnicity. And I found, and they had to have this moment of reflecting to be like, do I change my research questions? How do I do it? And they managed to kind of fit it into a way where they said, this wasn't the original research aim. This was for a master's thesis, but this was a really interesting finding because they hadn't considered oppression as intersectional. Or they thought they could kind of be like ethnic minority in one space because that was their lived experience. Whereas, and it was predominantly the girls who they were interviewing were like, I don't separate race and gender, so I'm discussing both. And that was I thought like a really interesting critical reflection to be like, that I couldn't think it. And of course, there's some ways you can go and you could rechange your research questions. And there's ways that you can say, like, maybe I would probably put in like my final finding to be like, this was a surprise. I didn't expect this. And that this is a critique of myself. I should have used an intersectional lens.
I also think there's something really interesting you're saying there, is that how your research is designed is important. Intersectionality, I think, is something that we don't necessarily reflect on sufficiently enough. Now, I'm a white scholar, I'm a white feminist scholar, but I also have to be mindful and acknowledge the fact that there are many intersecting identities that make a human and make a person, make a body. So how can we do justice to scholarship that sits outside our understanding? In a book that's coming out soon, I've started to think really carefully about Black and global majority scholarship. And I don't use Black and ethnic minorities because I think that the ethnic minorities is a real homogenizer. Global majority scholarship is people who are non-white, which is the majority of the population of the globe. So I'm starting to really think carefully about the key terms that I use when I work with scholarship, when I work with researchers, when I work with participants. We are very monocultural in the south coast of England, but there are many people who come from very diverse backgrounds. And I think that's important to start to acknowledge that and do that carefully and mindfully, but also be mindful that myself as a white woman, I can't put myself in a position of a Black woman's experience or an Asian woman's experience, but I have to be mindful that some of the decisions I make are very much based on my own subjectivity. And you can't necessarily overcome that, but you can acknowledge that in your work. So I think knowing and reading Black and global majority scholar work is really important. And it's something that I've taken on board over the last few years as I've been writing the book, because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't just coming from a very narrow viewpoint, that I was taking other viewpoints into consideration. And that's the focus of critical research, really. If you look at the critical research paradigm, it very much is looking at marginalisation, intersectionality, different experiences that people have, that the breadth of people have. And I'm trying to encompass some of those, but acknowledging our own bias and subjectivity in that process. So that takes time to get to that point, and it's taken me this long postdoctorally to really understand what that means. But I do think we need to reflect on some of those things as academics, as researchers, as students, because it's really important. And we are not a monolith in this country. We are very much comprised of a range of different ethnicities, backgrounds, and we need to acknowledge some of those things. And the marginalisation is strong wherever we are in the world.
And that is so interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I've just taken down a note of the key terms there to explore a little bit more into them. I think what you've touched upon, though, is it links back to literature review really beautifully, because a lot of what we are presented still in academic journals comes from Western institutions, and even if the writers aren't necessarily white, it's the way of constructing knowledge is in a Western framing. And it's difficult because when we talk about with students like looking for valuable research, you talk about citations, you talk about journals, but there's so much inequality in that it's also about going to, the lesser cited journals, going to and like pushing yourself to be like, actually, and I think this is interesting because I recommend students use like AI, like connected papers, when they're looking for articles. But I always try to get them to think about there's a potential you're going to be shown quite homogenous writers here. So make sure you go as well and check it, because I think tech could even exacerbate this potentially.
I think you're right. I mean, I'm not a big fan of AI, so I won't spend hours talking about that. But I do think there is a homogenizing mechanism in AI. It's developed by rich white Americans. The pressure on Indigenous and Black scholarship is huge at the moment. And I think we do have to acknowledge that the systemic biases run through the core of all global minority scholarship. From white scholars find it really hard to engage with that. And I just think we do have to start to look at them. Black feminists are amazing. The work of Black feminists is absolutely phenomenal. Other intersectional scholars is really key as well. So I try where I can to encourage my students to engage with that sort of work, because it's really important.
I love that. And I think just to add on, when I was a history, what I did probably focused on what I do now. And I was researching about powerful knowledge basically, and doing a bit of a critique saying that, what's powerful? And thinking about history from, first of all, a Confucianist lens, because I was in Hong Kong at the time, but also Papa Maori, it completely, and I know we had a lecture on this at the University of Portsmouth recently, but it completely shaped the way I thought about knowledge and about history. And it was kind of, in some ways, quite destabilizing when I considered that the way I'd been trained as a historian and the way I'd been training students
yeah,
was so uncritical, whilst I was like, this is the peak of criticality, because I was telling them there was one way. It was
yeah,
written text, really. It was analyzing it from like the way we analyze sources, like sort of like authorship, blah blah blah. And it's kind of this moment to be like, what is it? And it's interesting because I think it doesn't mean, and I just like I know you've mentioned this, but it doesn't mean you can't write about non-white experiences, like the same way that a man can't write about whatever. Or it doesn't have to be necessarily you can only write about the identity you connect with, but it's
no,
about being reflective in it. And if you can, like you just brought out, if there are terms that you're using, reach out to people or do your
yeah,
research and just always be reflecting on. I'm trying to think of
definitely.
my example is that I, for a long time, would say like science students, but
Mhm.
the more I explored that field, I was like, actually, I don't think that aligns with what I think. It would be a
Yeah,
student would send or etc. And it's
yeah,
even that changing of the terms can be so powerful in the way that you shift
definitely.
your whole mindset.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that there's really important scholarship that deals with some of that. There's actually some really interesting, I've been thinking a lot about relationality, and I know I'm digressing, but there's a lot of interesting scholarship in relationality in the UK context, in the Welsh context, in the Scottish context, you know. I think we can we don't always dig deep into some of those canons of knowledge because we are already going for the Eurasian American, you know, Europe, America, that dominant white centered research. There's lots of great white indigenous UK, who is an indigenous UK person, but you know, Welsh scholarship, Scottish scholarship. So I think there are ways that we can get around those sorts of things. But whatever we do, we need to pay respect to that research and to engage with it in our broader research. And again, this has only come to me in the last few years. So I think we're all on a bit of a research journey and we get to the point where we feel we're doing the things we need to do. We can't speak from a black feminist perspective necessarily, but we can say what their research is telling us about intersectionality, marginalisation, you know, and how we can harness that to really shed a spotlight on some of these things.
I love that, absolutely. Thank you. And I think, first of all, I am obviously Welsh, so that was music to my ears. But I think it's that and it will feed into your methodology then, I think really importantly, because again, I'm looking at RSE and there isn't enough research on um especially non-white teachers' experiences of teaching gender, or teaching RSE, etc. There's also if next to none about different religious faiths, etc., etc., etc. There's it's just not been fully explored, and it's then being like, okay, so I can't just really be approaching this from a gendered perspective. I need to consider very carefully who my sample are. I need to consider what kind of questions I'm asking, and then I need to consider for me, it was about how am I going to write this up. So I've added in a spot where I do collect demographic data because there is limited research on this. That when if I ever come to disseminate, hopefully, I can highlight the differences between participants from their self-disclosed identities.
Yeah, I think that's great. And that's another thing that's really key as part of your research to collect the demographic data. You never know when you might want to actually use some of that in any reports or any articles. And again, as you write things through, the last point I want to make is about ethics again. Be ethical when you write stuff up as well. When you write an article up, when you write a report up, think about the fact that these people have given their time and you want to do their words and their thoughts justice. Don't homogenize them and say everyone said this, you know, where you can be really clear. Use quotes, but use them respectfully. Make sure there's nothing in there that can identify a place, person, you know, put the name removed for or whatever. Just think about some of those respectful elements. And particularly as a student, when you research your own practice in your own context, be mindful of that because you don't realise that three pieces of information could triangulate where you are. So be really thoughtful about how you write up and how you make sure that you don't disclose where you are researching, who your participants might be, because someone could find that. And I think the challenges of AI now is it can triangulate off anything. So just be mindful of these sorts of things.
I think be incredibly mindful and then be very, very transparent. If you are researching, for example, if you're planning on researching at your university and this is easily, they're going to find that on LinkedIn or wherever, you need to make that very clear to your participants that they go in knowing that risk from the offset.
Exactly. And I think that becomes more challenging if you're doing something which is seen as more of a challenging topic area. But anyway, I think it's about being ethical and trying to ensure that you use pseudonyms, that you take away and identifying features. When you write a quote, you make sure that if necessary, you paraphrase some of it, or you just talk some of the quote and then you add some of the stuff paraphrased. So that, again, it's about protecting identity and being ethical in that regard. And you're not trying to show people in a bad light. You're trying to show, what they're saying, what their experiences are. So it's some of it's about moving it away from the individuals and making it more about some of the systems that you're talking about.
I've got that completely. And just to add in, there was, I guess this is an ethical example. I had a participant who we were talking about this school and they said something that could be perceived as critical. And then afterwards they were like, oh, I didn't quite mean it like that, and explained it. And unethically, I could have taken that first part of the quote and it would have been real powerful. But that would have been unethical because I knew their intention, that would have been potentially problematic for them, that they tried to reword it afterwards. So I made the decision to be like, I'm not including that because I don't feel comfortable that they wanted that said. Their reaction in that moment.
Agreed.
Yeah. And that's why I think you can obviously hire different transcript organizations, which can be very useful as lots of data, but I can't advise enough also going through yourself and listening carefully and adding in the notes to your transcription, because it's those things that you won't be able to pick up and you might forget about it, especially if you have a few. And you need to think of that moment, like, what is that pause saying? Why have they started speaking very quickly? How can I treat them with respect? Amazing.
We actually used that. I would say we used a transcription firm for that project because we had funding to do that. But actually, they actually did leave pause, dot pause. So it's really interesting listening and watching. So if you do ever use a transcription company to do that, again, make sure it's reputable and the university supports that. Also listen to the interviews as you're reading the transcript.
Yes. And that's what I was referring to, sorry. It's absolutely fine for you to use it, but make sure you don't just send it off and never listen again. And I mean, you imagine that like most people wouldn't, but just in case, you never know, I'm like, make sure you do listen to that yourself. And especially if they're like me, my accent is difficult to transcribe. My goodness, anyone who's watched a recorded lecture from me will understand. So I guess the last question, thank you so much for all of your time, by the way, is just if there's any final advice that you'd have for anyone, anything you think you've missed off.
Yeah, I think that planning is absolutely key. I think I've probably said that 3 or 4 times. Make a really good research plan before you start to do the research. Be really clear on what your research question and aims are. Understand and think about what methods you might want to use. What is your methodology? What is your method? What theory might be underpinning your research? So it's getting all that preparation work done before you go out and do that. And we did this on this particular project. We actually, as a team, we prepared and we read and we'd written the proposal already for the funder. So we already thought about all those sorts of things. So planning is absolutely key. When you're collecting your data, be ready for eventualities you weren't expecting, particularly if you're going to go and do visits and observations. Be mindful of all those sorts of things. Practically, check your recorder works if you're recording something. If you've got a dictaphone, make sure you've got batteries in it. I know that sounds really stupid, but I've got home and thought, oh no, I've got no batteries in my dictaphone. So all that practical stuff is really important. And then once you've got your data and it's been transcribed, we've used transcription companies in the past when we've got funding. I've never used AI. I'm not sure I'd want to because I don't know where it's going to go, but you can transcribe yourself. You can sometimes get these, if you play it, you can get like a transcription word or whatever. So find about ways you're going to do that and just find the time and the analysis will take the biggest bit of time. So make sure you put time aside for that. And then just enjoy and good luck. Do no harm, I suppose, is probably the last thing. Do no harm. That's
do no harm is the biggest one for me. And I think you've covered all of them so well. But I think the only thing I reflect on is sending out your research to academics in your university or in your field is vital. And if you have a particularly wonderful lecturer, try and get on a half-an-hour conversation to make sure you understand what they mean, because the feedback that's written can be wonderful, but also there's been times when I actually had it recently with an ethics board. I was submitting a substantial amendment, and they were like, can you just hop on a call for 5 minutes? Because I had read it that I had to rewrite everything. And they were like, no, you just need to, it's a sentence, add a sentence. And, I thought I understood feedback, but obviously I didn't. And it's that moment just to make sure you're checking in, because the more you can check in, of course, it's terrifying sending your work to another person.
Yeah,
But people are going to come with, like yourself, with so much experience and things that you know that you can sometimes only get from experience, that you'll be like,
I agree.
actually, this would be a problem.
I agree. And I think that you've touched on a really important point. I get a lot of my work read by colleagues that I know, and I choose people that I know because I know they're not just going to go, this is crap. They're going to actually give me constructive feedback. So pick your reviewers really well if you can, pick your critical friends really well, and draw on their experiences, because even someone who's been researching for a number of years, I don't know everything. So I have critical friends that can say, oh, so and so, tell me a little bit about this. I don't quite understand how that works. Be a bit more humble. No one is ever going to know everything. And I love it when someone asks me a question because I can talk about it for hours, which is great. So, which is
Yeah.
why I've enjoyed this so much. But, do use other people, speak to them, draw on their experiences, because we're all here to help. We all started off as a novice researcher, and even now I don't feel myself as an established researcher. I'm still working it through. So I think it's about just recognizing we're on a bit of a journey.
Absolutely. That was such a wonderful way to end. Well, Nikki, thank you so much. I'm going to stop the
You're
recording now,
welcome.
if that's okay.